The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 20th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme.
To be with everyone this evening in this hall and everyone at home. This is going to be a great week.
U.S. presidential candidate Kamala Harris makes a surprise appearance at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago on a night that saw Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton passing the torch to a new generation of party leaders. We'll hear from Chicago and assess the mood with Monocle's Laura Kramer right here in studio. After that, we'll assess whether U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken really has Israeli agreement on a ceasefire as he claims. We'll have the latest business headlines, and then
we have currently 8 proceedings ongoing, including one against X. And during this investigation, we have now sent preliminary findings to X on 3 grievances: 2 remain open, disinformation and illegal content, on which we have exchanges with the platform.
We'll hear from the European Commission on whether it could fine Elon Musk for failing to tackle conspiracy theories on social media. And finally, Monocle's own Fernando Augusto Pacheco is here to talk about the late Brazilian television icon Slivio Santos. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. In Chicago last night, the story was one of the Democratic past handing off to the future. Former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton and current President Joe Biden gave speeches, Hillary drawing the arc of women in American politics and handing off to Kamala Harris, Biden highlighting his own achievements in office and handing off to his vice president. And then there were the protests over Palestine, which turned out to be somewhat smaller than expected, but nonetheless drew a fair amount of coverage. H.J. Mai is among our team in Chicago this week and sent us this report.
Hours before the first speaker took the stage at Chicago's United Center yesterday, thousands gathered at a park less than a mile away. They showed up to take part in the first of 2 March on the DNC rallies, a pro-Palestinian coalition that demands an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and a stop of all U.S. aid to Israel.
It is unconscionable that both major political parties in the U.S. are complicit in aiding and sending arms and ammunition to continue the most documented genocide in human history. I think they are intentionally turning a blind eye to the massacre of the Palestinian people.
Sarah is from Chicago, and even though she did not want to provide her last name, she felt the need to show her support for the people of Gaza. The Biden/Harris administration's current policy toward Israel is costing it Sarah's vote. And she's not alone. Elaine from Milwaukee says if Harris wants her vote, she needs to make a change.
The status quo isn't good enough anymore. We really need that change. And she's not giving us, change. She's giving us status quo again.
Neither of them will vote for former President Donald Trump. But their decision to maybe not vote at all, or for a third-party candidate, could be the difference come November. Palestinian-American Yusuf Kasha reiterated this point.
Democrats will say, well, you know, Trump is going to be worse than the Democrats, but I say, what's worse than genocide? What's worse than what we're seeing day in and day out, all the bombing of the innocent civilians, too. So if the Democrats want to change our mind and get our vote, they need to take a stand. And they're not willing to do that.
The protests stayed largely peaceful. However, some decided to tear down a security fence near the United Center, verbally confront law enforcement officers, and even throw water bottles. The situation could have easily escalated, but it didn't. Inside the United Center, the incident didn't receive much attention. Democrats were focused on their agenda and lined up some of their big names for the first night, like New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Democrats have been riding a high since President Biden ended his re-election bid, and the party quickly united behind Harris. And this energy was palpable. Throughout the evening, one speaker after another made a point of painting Vice President Harris as someone who cares about people, while alleging that Trump is only in it for himself.
Just look at the candidates. Kamala cares about kids and families, cares about America. Donald only cares about himself.
Former First Lady and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who lost to Trump in 2016, also talked about the potential history of Harris becoming America's first female president.
Together, we put a lot of cracks in the highest, hardest glass ceiling. And you know what? On the other side of that glass ceiling is Kamala Harris raising her hand and taking the oath of office as our 47th president of the United States.
The one currently occupying that office closed out the night after receiving praise for his work as president, including during a surprise appearance from Harris herself.
Joe, thank you for your historic leadership, for your lifetime of service to our nation, and for all you will continue to do. We are forever grateful to you.
It was Biden's turn to soak it all in. Biden, who was introduced by his daughter Ashley, got emotional and even had tears in his eyes. But it was all business from there on. He talked about his successes while in office, and he highlighted Harris's role in all of it.
Selecting Kamala was the very first decision I made when I became our nominee. And it was the best decision I made my whole career.
And he called on Americans to vote for her in November because
we need you to beat Donald Trump.
He finished his remarks by thanking the people for their support over the past 5 decades.
I made a lot of mistakes in my career, but I gave my best to you. For 50 years, like many of you, I've given my heart and soul to our nation.
It was a strong opening night for Democrats as Biden passed the torch to the next generation. But as yesterday's protests have shown, now it's time to convince voters. For Monocle in Chicago, I'm H.J. Mike.
Thank you very much, H.J. Mai in Chicago. Joining me now here in the studio is Monocle's Laura Kramer. Laura, we heard that clip from Joe Biden there at the end, talking about making a lot of mistakes, but giving his best. He also had this line about being, too young to be a senator, too old to be president. Do we feel sorry for Joe?
In a way, I do, because this is a man who has spent the majority of his life in public service. It did feel like it was an unfortunate, such a wonderful career he's had as a politician. He was kind of pushed out toward the end, but I'll tell you what, I don't think there was a sense of bitterness. He made jokes. He really downplayed any hard feelings he may have had about being displaced from the race. And it was emotional, though. Chants of "Thank you, Joe." He had tears in his eyes. Kamala did too. I was getting choked up. It's sad to see, but overall, I think the mood was very excited.
It was very exciting. It really did feel like this passing of the torch, didn't it? Both Joe Biden, but also, as I mentioned in the intro, Hillary Clinton. She kind of drew this arc about women in politics, the fact that her mother, 104 years ago, was born when a time when women couldn't vote. But what did we make of that mood, I suppose, this idea of kind of passing the torch? This is really this step to a new and kind of unproven but new generation.
Yeah, I want to touch on the Hillary point because I think if you spend a lot of time online, it's easy to imagine her as a disliked politician by even her own party. But remember, she won the popular vote in 2016, and I think we can sometimes underestimate actually how respected she is. And a lot of people make jokes about her being bitter, watching another woman become the first female president of the United States. But at least publicly, she's been graceful, supportive, and many have called it a very classy speech that was very impassioned for Kamala Harris, and made a little joke about Donald Trump making history of his own, being the first president to run when 34 felony counts. But I think another very impassioned speech, that passing of the torch, was no questions asked. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, hands down, very good, fired up the crowd, playing, saying Harris worked for securing a ceasefire in Gaza. Of course, this all as pro-Palestinian. Protesters are gathered around outside the convention. And I think her biggest moment, though, was when she took on Trump about being on corporate greed.
Let's have a listen.
And I, for one, am tired of hearing about how a two-bit union buster thinks of himself as more of a patriot than the woman who fights every single day to lift working people out from under the boots of greed, trampling on our way of life.
Laura, it is interesting listening to AOC there, the parallels with the Obamas and Barack Obama that have been drawn. Barack Obama himself will be speaking tonight. What did you make of her performance? I mean, this is that sign, again, of kind of the new generation. Kamala Harris will have to prove herself first, and then we kind of move on to AOC, although she is also this interesting, firebrand, trying now to maybe broaden her popularity.
She's a progressive, and, people talk about potentially Joe Biden and Kamala Harris being more establishment, so to think. And it's nice to, at least from her point of view, Kamala Harris's, to see the progressives and more leftist liberals coming to her side. It's important to have her on side because I do think down the line this will be a big leader for the Democrats in a few years.
And speaking of people being on side, the other interesting aspect of this, of course, was the fact that we had Joe Biden tonight. We have Barack Obama, or last night. We have Barack Obama tonight, the Clintons, Bill Clinton as well. All of these kind of establishment Democratic figures, which contrasts pretty dramatically with Donald Trump's Republican National Convention that we had as well, where no former presidents or presidential candidates appeared. He's very much still characterizing himself as the outsider, going to shake things up, take down the establishment. Does Kamala Harris have a bit of an issue there with maybe like she's becoming the establishment candidate, but it does also show unity, of course?
Well, I mean, has he actually come up with something to attack her on? It feels like Donald Trump is still stuck on Joe Biden. It feels like he almost wants to wrong or right what he believes the wrong of 2020 was. They have yet to really come up with a concrete message against Kamala Harris. Maybe if they try the establishment route, but so far everything they're trying isn't really landing. That's why Trump is also bringing in former people from 2016 to try to shake up the campaign again.
Thanks very much, Laura. That was Monocle's Laura Kramer. Thanks also to HJ Mai. And now, here's Tom Webb with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. George Santos has pleaded guilty to fabricating fundraising figures and donor names during the 2022 election cycle. Breon Peace, the U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York, said constituents who elected Santos were victims of a fraud of unprecedented proportion, and they had to watch helplessly while Santos rode into Congress on a campaign of lies. The former congressman could face up to 22 years in prison. The Czech Defence Ministry has said it is leading an EU-wide effort to use interest earned on frozen Russian assets to buy more munitions for Ukraine. Czech officials say the first consignment was sent in June and will continue each month. The Kremlin has labelled this initiative as theft and is threatening legal action against anyone involved in the scheme. Morgan Stanley International Bank chairman Jonathan Bloomer and his wife are among those missing after a British yacht sank off the coast of Sicily. The tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch and his daughter also remain unaccounted for. The search continues with an emphasis on gaining access to the yacht's cabins. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Tom. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had been initially scheduled to visit the Middle East last week, but he delayed to this week in the hopes that enough progress would have been made to secure a ceasefire deal in Gaza. After meetings with Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and others, Blinken has now claimed that Israel accepts a ceasefire deal, with contours of it at the very least, and that the ball is in Hamas's court. Well, here to tell us whether that is true or not is Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow at Chatham House and Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Roehampton. Yossi, always good to have you on the show. Is this one of those things, again, kind of like Joe Biden in the past, insisting a deal is near, but not really? I mean, Blinken says they accept a bridging proposal as if there are only a few minor sticking points.
Hello, Chris. It's difficult to know because as you alluded, they said time and again accepting the proposal, and then when it seems that the other side accepted the proposal, then new conditions all of a sudden appeared. The question is again whether this bridging proposal is final, and the United States is going to insist that take it or leave it. Or then you open the negotiation again because one of the sides said no. In this case, we saw with Netanyahu in the past. Basically, the original Biden proposal was something that was almost devised by the Israeli government, and then came a new condition. And I think right now, because it also involved with what's happening with Lebanon, with the Hezbollah and Iran, to see whether this actually can avert a war between Israel and Hezbollah, potentially Iran, and dragging the region into a war.
Do we know, Yossi, at all about whether some of these additional conditions that Israel had added to this have actually been resolved? Because, I mean, Tony Blinken has kind of said before that Israel accepts the contours, the framework of a deal. But, of course, the key sticking points were about Israel's ongoing presence in Gaza or at the border with Egypt. Do we have any sign that that has been solved?
Well, that's, I think, what the bridging proposal is all about, to deal with the two corridors, mainly the corridor, the Philadelphia, along the border with Egypt. There is some logic to it in order to prevent weapons to be smuggled into Gaza. But then we are moving into a different issue. This agreement is about ceasefire and the release of the hostages. It always should be seen as an interim agreement. It's not the final agreement. It will have few phases that will end the war. But the question is what happened beyond this. The presence of Israel in Gaza shouldn't continue indefinitely. A ceasefire should lead to a political process that will end Israel presence there, but also ensure its security and the security of everyone. So now we're concentrating as if this is a permanent, condition in which Israel will continue to be present on the border with Egypt. Also, the other corridor, the Netzarim, that cuts from north to south. But again, the question is, for how long, and what are the next stages.
Thank you very much to Yossi Meckelberg there. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak, and it's time now to get the latest business headlines with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, global stock markets, how many times can we talk about the stock markets and their ups and downs? But they have been in a buoyant mood at the moment. What's behind the optimism?
Yeah, they certainly have, Chris. Global stocks on course for their longest winning streak since last year. The MSCI All-Country Stock Index heading for a 9th day of increases. It's all a far cry from the panic sell-off we saw 2 Mondays ago. At its core was the unwinding of trades involving the Japanese yen after the Bank of Japan surprised markets with an outsized increase in interest rates. But it was also about worries about the US economy, the concerns that the much talked about soft landing might be, well, not all that soft. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen some better data from the US, including on retail sales, showing that the US consumer is alive and well. And the worries about the US economy seem to have faded into the background. So there's now talk that we are, in fact, in some kind of Goldilocks scenario where the US economy has inflation that is low enough for us to start cutting interest rates, but without it falling off a cliff. That would be the dream scenario for, well, not just for the stock market, but for politicians and residents of the US as well. So the hope is that we are getting very close to that US rate cut, the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates for the first time. Of course, a number of central banks around the world have already embarked on this process. We had a rate cut today from Sweden, not the first country. We've seen rate cuts starting to appear around Europe over the last couple of months or so. We're going to get more later in the week as central bankers from around the world gather for the Federal Reserve's Jackson Hole Economic Symposium, something which markets get very excited about. Of course, the star guest is Fed Chair Jay Powell. He'll be giving comments at the meeting at the end of the week, and it's widely expected that he will flag that rate cuts are on the way. I think if he doesn't do that, then there will be a lot of disappointment because that is the widespread expectation. So finally, it does look like we're inching towards those interest rate cuts in the US.
Goldilocks moment. Love that. We'll see if it continues with those speeches at Jackson Hole later in the week. But you have one other story for us, Ewan. More details about a plan for tariffs on electric vehicles from the European Union following the US.
Yeah, the EU's put forward its draft proposals for tariffs on electric vehicles imported from China. Brussels believes, much like the US, that China's car makers benefit from an array of subsidies which makes competition unfair. Teslas imported into the EU will face a 9% tariff under the plans. The EU says that the American company benefits from the provision of batteries at below market rate, income tax reduction and grants in various forms, among other subsidies. If that 9% tariff goes through, though, it looks like Tesla will have got off rather lightly compared to some of its competitors. The proposed tariffs on some of the big Chinese car makers are pretty hefty. MG maker SAIC Motor Corporation faces tariffs of 36%. Volvo Cars parent company Geely of 19%, and BYD, which is the world's biggest maker of electric vehicles, of 17%. Now, all of these will be imposed on top of the existing 10% duties currently faced by exporters from China. It is part of a consultation process which is still ongoing. Got a couple more weeks left to run, and it does need a qualified majority of EU member states to pass. And it should be said that not everybody is happy with this in Europe. We know that China does not take these things lying down. If these were imposed, the chances of Beijing just letting it pass have got to be pretty slim. China itself says that the measures are protectionist, and it's already threatened to retaliate with duties of its own on all sorts of things, including pork, spirits, and other key exports from EU countries. So I think it's clear if China picks this fight with Beijing, then we're going to see more in this particular tariff war.
Ewan Potts, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Speaking of Tesla wrangling with the European Union, Elon Musk, the boss of Tesla and X, his interview with Donald Trump last week sparked criticism from various corners and not just within the United States. The European Union's digital commissioner, Thierry Breton, in a letter to Musk, warned that he could fall foul of the EU's Digital Services Act if he didn't rein in hate speech, prompting a particularly undiplomatic reply in the form of a meme from Musk himself. Well, Thomas Renier is the European Commission's spokesperson for digital research and innovation. He spoke with Monocle's Andrew Muller about what exactly the European Union can do to rein in X and social media companies that do not comply with its laws.
Well, the EU has powers that are similar to the antitrust powers that we have now. Basically, the DSA foresees, and it's maybe very easy to start with this, basically, with the DSA, we want platforms to be more responsible when it comes to societal risks, such as interference in political elections, such as the protection of minors, illegal content, disinformation, etc. So we're looking at the platforms, and the Commission is responsible for the supervision of the very large online platforms. So the ones that we have designated that reach more than 45 million users in the EU. So the DSA is only applicable in the EU. This is very important to notice too. We have powers, and we have now several contacts with the very large online platforms that we're supervising. We have currently 8 proceedings ongoing, including one against X. And during this investigation, we have now sent preliminary findings to X on 3 grievances: to remain open, disinformation and illegal content, on which we have exchanges with the platform.
I mean, do you think there is a feeling among EU institutions now that they wish they had taken on the tech giants, especially the social media platforms, a bit earlier? Because we do now seem to be doing that thing, as is often the way, where legislation scrambles to try and keep up with advancing technology.
That's a good point. I think if you see it the other way around, we are quite advanced to other jurisdiction elsewhere in the world. So we're quite advanced on this, and it is quite effective. I mean, we're still, all of us, in a learning process, be it the platforms, be it the DSA enforcers here within the Commission. It's a very recent tool that is applicable since August of last year for the very large online platforms, but it has already shown that it is quite successful. I mean, there was one concrete example last week with TikTok Lite that was launched in the EU, where we had clear doubts about the potential addictive design of it, and TikTok came back to us and suspended this rewards program. So we see already some concrete examples, effective examples. Another one is Meta and the CrowdTangle tool that they wanted to discontinue just ahead of the European elections, which was not the best move in our views. They have decided to keep it on until the European election. So we see already now good developments under the DSA, but this has to continue, of course.
I mean, in enforcing those rules, are there ever any considerations given to domestic political reaction? Because especially if you took extremely severe measures against a social media platform, there might well be unpopularity with the European public, and there would, of course, be optics around freedom of speech as well. Does that kind of thinking factor into these decisions, or is it just rigorous, impartial application of the rules?
This does not only factor into these decisions. This is part, actually, of the Digital Services Act, where freedom of speech is at the very core of the legislation. Why? Because what we ask under the DSA, and this is very easy, is what is defined as illegal, not in the DSA, but in national law, in EU law, and international law, has no place online and needs to be removed as soon as the platform is notified. So, of course, let's take the example of X again. We cannot ask X or any other platform to monitor every individual content that is there online. This is impossible to do. Otherwise, they wouldn't operate here because the burden would be too high for the platform. And we want them to operate here. But what we asked the platforms to do, and this is already in place, to set up a notice and action mechanism, meaning that you, as a user, if you're confronted to illegal content that you see in your feed, you should be able to flag it to the platform. And as soon as the platform has been notified, then its role kicks in and it needs to remove that content. And we have doubts that this is currently effective on X. This is why the proceedings are ongoing.
I mean, how do you see these rules evolving, though? Because, we've seen obviously very recently in the United Kingdom, social media platforms, especially X, being used to accelerate disinformation that had terrible real-world consequences. It's not difficult to imagine a circumstance in which, one or more EU member states might decide that a particular platform is actually a threat to its own national security. Do you see the evolution of these laws coming round to greater regulation of the platforms?
Well, also I think there's always room for improvement in any type of legislation, and we're open to that. And I don't exclude that at some point the DSA also evolves a little bit. But also this has already been taken into account and was the case. You remember the riots after the stabbing that took place in Dublin last year in November. There were riots in Ireland with a lot of hate speech online and a lot of disinformation. So indeed what happened is that member states have the possibility, the national authorities, to trigger the so-called incident protocol foreseen under the DSA. And with this incident protocol, the national authorities, together with the Commission, get in touch with the platforms and the representatives in their compliance teams and to ask them what they're doing concretely to avoid an amplification of this disinformation posts online. Now, on UK more specifically, of course, the DSA is only applicable in the EU, so we wouldn't ask any company to adopt certain measures for events happening outside of the EU, but we don't exclude spillover effects into the EU. And that's, for example, now in the current context with what's going on in the UK, you could have a lot of anti-Muslim hate speech online that spreads in the EU. And this could potentially then be taken into account in the current proceedings that we have, because then it's visible in the EU and the platform needs to act.
That was the EU spokesperson Thomas Renier in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Muller. You can check out the latest episode of The Foreign Desk for more on Elon Musk and the tech company's battle with global governments. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, yesterday we spoke about the passing of French film icon Alain Delon, and today we turn to Brazil, where President Lula da Silva has declared 3 days of mourning in the country for its own icon of television, Slivio Santos. Here to tell us more about Santos' legacy, we can think of nobody better than our very own senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, Slivio Santos, a Brazilian TV legend, is that fair? Tell us about him.
Very fair, and I think it's very easy for me as a Brazilian to talk about him because I grew up with him. So, like him or not, and I have to say the majority of Brazilians do like him. He has a gift for communication. And I think the reasons why Brazilians connected with him so much is because of his upbringing. So before I tell you, who he became, but when he was 14, he was a street seller in Rio de Janeiro. So he had quite, I wouldn't say a poor upbringing, but, it was quite, I think a lot of Brazilians could relate to that. But then he moved to São Paulo as a very ambitious man, the son of Jewish immigrants who came from Turkey and Greece. And he became this folkloric figure. And he launched his own TV network in 1981, but he had a lot of experience before with other networks. But not only was he the owner, he was the host of weekly shows on that channel.
What kind of shows?
It was, shows, kind of a lot of game shows and kind of interviews. It was such a mix. It was a very unique. The show was called The Program of Slivio Santos. And he made all the rules. And there was even an insider joke here. The schedule of SBT, the name of his network, used to change all the time. Because Slivio Santos used to call people, I don't like this, change that. But it really changed all the time. So sometimes you're watching a TV show that starts at 7, the next day will be at 8, the next day at 9. But funnily enough, it was a success.
Keeping the staff and listeners, viewers on their feet.
And it was big. It was the second largest network in Brazil till 2007. Now I believe is the third. But, in a country dominated by Globo, our main broadcaster, I think, Slivio Santos was a great competitor, but he was very different than Globo. Globo was very almighty, a little bit kind of, snooty at times. But I think Slivio Santos, he was unashamedly a little bit of a populist and fun as well, his shows, he used to send banknotes to the audience. And he was like, who wants money? And used to throw out those banknotes. But Chris, I think you need a little taster of Silvio Santos.
I would like a little taster. We need to get a sense of the man.
Let's play a clip.
You didn't say that he sang as well, Faye. He did everything.
He also sang. and he looked, I think he looked great, even when he was 93 years old. But there was something kitsch about his appearance. I think he probably did some cosmetic surgery here and there. His toupee was very famous. In fact, his hairdresser, Jasse, was one of his best friends. And he always mentioned him. So his hair was always impeccable.
So an impeccable toupee. That's what we're talking about.
That's what we're talking about.
Okay. He made toupees popular in Brazil.
Oh yes. What a strong connection he had with the Brazilian audience. That's very unique. If you ask me, there's no one like Silvio Santos today. There isn't.
Well, to that point, yes. Is there somebody? How much of a hole does he leave in Brazilian television? Is there somebody that can take his place?
I don't think so. It's impossible. I wonder what's going to happen with his network, SBT as well. But we need to talk as well. What Silvio was very interesting, his relationship with politics. I think that's a very interesting one because he was friendly with every single Brazilian leader, from the dictatorship to Lula and to Bolsonaro.
He didn't pick sides.
He didn't really pick...
In some ways.
So, there was journalism in his networks, but he always said we shouldn't become enemies of the state. But that was Silvio Santos for you. That was kind of a very unique approach to news he had. In the end, it was all about entertainment. It was all about the man himself.
Just finally on that note then, Faye, what was your earliest memory of him growing up?
Well, it is a joke, but we always wanted a little bit of money as kids. So we always, when he came with his little paper planes with Brazilian notes to the audience, that was the dream. I was
you wanted to be in that audience, catch the paper plane?
That's definitely my earliest memory of Silvio Santos. And honestly, Chris, even on my later years or every time I go to Brazil, if he's on TV, I will be watching.
Fernando, Augusto, Pacheco, thank you very much for joining us. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Christy O'Grady. Our researchers were Sana Jumani and Gunnar Grunlid, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.